It's great to see familiar faces and new faces, and I hope you're looking forward to the talk as much as I am. So it falls upon me to introduce our distinguished guest today, Dr. Jessica Hawkins. Dr. Hawkins received a BA in European Studies with what we would call minors, I think, but I could be wrong, in German and Italian from Lancaster University in 2005. She completed her master's in international development, focusing on poverty, conflict, and reconstruction in the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester in 2009. And subsequently, she earned a PhD in development policy and management at the same institute in 2016. In August 2014, Dr. Hawkins began her appointment as a lecturer at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. And in 2021, she was promoted to senior lecturer in humanitarian studies. Her research focuses on pedagogies of humanitarianism, state formation, and histories of displacement in the camp. Dr. Hawkins has published articles in scholarly journals, book chapters, working papers, as well as policy briefs. We're not, at least as an academic, I'm not too familiar with those last two genres. We don't get to publish as much as we should, but I really highlight that as a really important collaboration, right, and moving beyond the university. So working papers as well as policy briefs in these research areas, and has also presented her work at several academic conferences, both national, British in this case, and international venues. The title of her talk today is Experiential Learning, you have it right there, in Humanitarian Studies, Ethics, and Discomfort of Student Research Visits to Uganda. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Jessica Hawkins.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say firstly, huge thanks to Luis and Alea and Unifier for helping support my visit here today, and for the Africa at Noon series for hosting me and being willing to hear me talk to you today about what we would say are our research visits to Uganda. And yeah, I'm from the University of Manchester in the UK, and this forms part of a very special semester that I've had, which has been a sabbatical, which is unheard of for people like me who are teaching and scholarship lecturers. So my main purpose is to teach at the university, and very rarely do we get sabbaticals. And although you kind of highlighted my elaborate publication history, it's not that great actually. It's because we are constantly doing teaching, and so this sabbatical has been part of trying to improve my research output as a senior lecturer in the institute and a senior member of the institute as well. So this forms part of a paper that I am developing, which is a wider, bigger project about the pedagogies of humanitarianism. But this paper looks at ethics and discomfort of taking students on research visits to situations of displacement. And in particular, I take our students to Uganda, and we just returned at the end of January from our research visit. Just a little bit of background about who we are. I'm from the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute. There's only a few institutes in the world that look at humanitarianism and teach humanitarianism, and we are one of them. We provide UG programs and PG programs, distance learning, which we were talking about earlier, and for those working for the big international NGOs, but also those who, like myself back in the day, thought that we could save the world. And we had the belief that, yeah, we get a master's in this, and then we can actually become someone who can help save everyone from the worst forms of human atrocities that exist. And of course, Manchester is quite a critical university, and so they put paid to that, and they teach you to let's take a step back and let's think about your right place. And this module that I'm going to talk about, it's a teaching module, contributes to that. But we work, the Institute in general works in policy, but also in research, in health, in peace and conflict studies, in international disaster management, which I try to not get too much involved with. And then also we focus on knowledge production. And my teaching focuses on displacement, as Luis talked about, displacement and conflict in the East African setting. But I also do a number of courses on historical sociology of the camp, for example. And I would call myself a historical sociologist. I dabble a bit in history and I dabble a bit in sociology, and then I mix the two together. And that's the basis of my PhD to begin with. I was looking at processes, long-term processes of state formation in Uganda. So, firstly, I just want to point out, who am I? In all my classes, and in particular in this module that I'm going to talk to you about today, I ask students to think very carefully about their positionality, about where they situate themselves within the wider world and their thinking. And I had loads of slides on this, but I realised that I could just talk about myself and that would just be quite boring. So I just thought I'd point out, I've been part of this Academics of Working Class heritage project. As you know, us Brits are obsessed with class, but we've been trying to interrogate the pathways to academia for those who come from, originate from working class backgrounds. So yes, I am a white working class, but I would say now middle class academic. I have a family who have a history of working for the British Armed Forces, who travelled a lot and who were linguists, hence why I ended up studying languages. And they talked a lot, especially my grandparents, about their travels to these conflict-affected countries with the British Armed Forces. Somehow along the lines, I moved out of, from my undergraduate degree and ended up working in exhaust sales. But then I came back to academia and started that PhD in development studies. So I am shaped by the colonial guilt of my country. I am intrigued by travel and understanding the world beyond our borders. And I believe in the freedom of movement. And as a British citizen, I am currently continuously enraged by our policies that we have for asylum seekers, for those who are seeking refuge. And I admire the Ugandan system, and Uganda is my case study that I would talk about today. Albeit I know about its faults. I understand there are faults within that system and issues within that system of asylum for refugees in Uganda. And then fundamentally underlying this module that I teach, I want our students to know their privilege of studying at a Western institution and to realise the potential for humanitarianism in the right place. And I'll come back to that later. I've been leading student research visits to East Africa for the past 13 years, and I would include the COVID part within that, because even though I was on maternity leave for a couple of years during COVID, I led virtual research visits for our students, and I can talk more about them as well later, but this focuses on in-person ones. So I'm going to cover just these main areas today in the seminar, in the discussion, and would welcome questions or points, comments. I've left out post-it notes because I'm not sure about seminars, but sometimes seminars in the US and seminars in the UK can sometimes have a deathly silence. So as I'm talking, if you think of one word that particularly strikes you, please jot that down, and that could be a good way to start a conversation afterwards on your post-it note. So this paper firstly starts by talking about the pedagogy of student research visits. And I put field visits there, or field trips, because the literature predominantly comes from geography or its subsidiaries, so environmental studies or tourism studies. There is very little written about humanitarianism field trips. And I should point out, in terms of terminology, for the purposes of clarity, this paper does not consider internships or placements which tend to be longer in duration. We currently have an undergrad student of mine who's in Malawi at the moment, dealing with the aftermath of the Cyclone Freddy as a disaster student. But I'm not talking about those longer trips. I'm talking about those short stay visits, which can last between a day and a month. And specifically the one I'm talking about, we usually stay about 12 days in Uganda. And it considers the value of these research visits for students of humanitarianism, and when they are studying the worst forms of the human condition. The term field trip sits uneasily with me. It conjures up images of buses of tourists voyeuristically travelling around a country with their camera phones in hand. So in our department, we prefer the term research visit, which implies that our travels, wherever they may be, and they are not just our undergraduate travels, go to India and have been to Northern Ireland. So wherever they may be, they are not underpinned by tourist enjoyment although incidentally they may contribute to that country's tourism economy. But students have to understand that their visit will have a purpose, and that will namely be an ethically sensitive research element to it. So the pedagogy, the literature on student research visits talks about how working in the field helps to create an understanding for students of how theory can work in practice. It provides real-life examples of the problems and principles that they discuss in the classroom. It provides alternative perspectives of academic phenomena that they engage with in that classroom. And it leads to deeper learning, which in turn results in better retention of knowledge, practice, and experience. I have students I'm still in touch with 13 years later who still talk about their research visit being a fundamental part of their degree, their memories of that degree, and how it's impacted their work. We engage with practitioners and stakeholders, and then we also help students to make connections, not just in terms of contacts, which of course is obviously a side benefit of these visits, but also mentally make connections between what they have learnt in the classroom and how that actually plays out in reality in humanitarian practice in Uganda. And we want them to develop confidence on the topic, and we tend to find the students that have attended these research visits are much more confident when it comes to their process of writing their dissertation a month later or so. And obviously there are career skills, career benefits to these research visits. So my module specifically is called Researching Responses to Displacement. I wasn't quite sure how to translate that to the US version of credits, but it's a one semester. It takes place from September through to December, and it constitutes about 20 hours of contact time through lectutorials, as we call them, lecture, tutorial, bit of discussion in between, in the first semester of our students' master's program. So it's specifically aimed at master's students. And this year we went to two main locations. We went down to Mbarara in January and also Kampala, and we did visits to the refugee settlement in Nachirali. But we've been to other areas in Uganda. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of explaining where the context of the background of the module comes from, but as I've said, my teaching crosses both conflict and humanitarian response. So I've looked in my own research, in my own blog posts, in my own policy reports, I've been looking at backgrounds of refugees and the histories of refugees in Uganda. And that stemmed from kind of a side project from my PhD. So looking at those who fled the country during the turbulent years post-independence, but also those who forcibly displaced during the colonial period as well. And then most recently, as we approached 50 years since the Ugandan Asians were expelled, I conducted research on the humanitarian response to the Ugandan Asians as they came to the UK. So yeah, we are, as an institute, we are quite critical of humanitarianism and development intervention. And I think my thinking about these topics was framed in the late 2000s when we were reflecting on those periods of 1990s intervention that took place. We tried to track the evolution from imperial to intervention to international agency intervention. So we do try to encompass history within our teaching. And we interrogate the ideological underpinnings of intervention, and we try and think of these narratives that are produced about humanitarianism and how they are created and who creates those within our teaching of this module. And then we try and think about it as that this is a global issue. Humanitarian response is something that is required in Manchester, where we live, where we teach. And our students are now, as a consequence of having seen humanitarian response in Uganda, a number of them are now volunteering with the Care for Calais organisation, which works in Manchester to help respond to the Afghanistan and Ukrainian refugees that we have in Manchester now. And we try to engage with the scholarship that is produced in Uganda or by Ugandans on displacement. So we try and, there's a lot of discussion at Manchester about decolonizing the curriculum. So we try to actively engage with perhaps articles that are not readily available to Western institutions, and that's through our networks and contacts in Uganda. And yeah, we try and discuss the encounters of resistance to Western influence of humanitarian response. So we have at Manchester what we call intended learning outcomes, so they're outward-facing details about the module. And we encourage students to examine displacement in detail in one specific context, namely Uganda. We want them to examine the challenges of conducting research in a fragile setting. And research skills are essential for all sectors of the all areas of the humanitarian sector. And we want, a lot of times, humanitarians have to find out fast. And we want to create humanitarians that are able to do that in a sensitive and reflective way. And that module hopefully helps to do that. And obviously we want them to learn how to translate academic research into practice. For me, the inward-facing intended learning outcomes are to try and interrogate this white saviour complex in humanitarian settings. We have a large number of international students who do our master's programme, but also a large number of British students who have never had the opportunity or chance to work in the humanitarian field, and who perhaps, like myself, go into the field thinking that they can then work in the global south or in somewhere else where they can respond to disasters. And actually we want them to interrogate, is that the best place for them? I want to educate more ethically sensitive humanitarians and gain practical experience so that they may compete with others in the sector, which is becoming increasingly a competitive sector to work. I want them to have this experience in a safe space, and that's the reason why I've been mainly going to Uganda for 13 years for these research visits. We did have 1 year where we went to Rwanda as well. And we want them to have lessons which they can apply to situations of displacement in their own countries or the countries in which they would like to work in the future. I want them to think about the ethics that we teach them, that we ingrain in them in Manchester. The Manchester Ethics Committee is pretty rigorous and quite hard to get through in terms of you have to go through a number of meetings in order to prove that you can do research. I want them to take those ethics and translate that to what that might mean in a Ugandan setting. So in terms of the actual teaching and to try and create this ethically sound teaching, I use Kolb's experiential learning cycle. And this is just a rough diagram. I'm going to talk through these phases of how that works in terms of the actual teaching of the module. I also use a former colleague, Roger McGinty's guidance on student research visits and tie these together to create a research visit that I think is ethically sound, but also supports the needs of both those we are engaging with, but also our students. So the first part of the cycle talks about abstract conceptualization. We want our students to have the least impact on the communities they meet, and that's part of the intended learning outcomes of the teaching. We want them to be well prepared, and so we have these 10 two-hour lectorials throughout the semester in which they understand the context. So our overarching theme is displacement, but we have 4 sub-themes within that. And displacement, we think of it as both affecting refugees in Uganda, but also the host communities as well. And so our 4 themes have been this year on gender-based sexual violence or gender-based violence, environmental conflict, namely land became the big topic within that, citizenship and belonging, how refugees and host communities created those senses of belonging, and then mental health. That was a new addition for this year's module. And we dedicate or lectorial to each of those sub-themes so that they can thoroughly understand the literature, what is being said about that context and that topic before they go out to Uganda, so that they are well versed on all the literature or the research, the current up-to-date research that's taking place. The next part of Kolb's, I should have pointed out that we also have preparation that talks about research methods. So although our students receive research methods training at Manchester for their master's programme, a lot of that research methods training is not specifically dedicated to finding out fast. And so we have what's called active experimentation, so Kolb's next part of the cycle. So we have dedicated sessions on the research skills that they will need, teaching students about quantitative questionnaires or semi-structured interviews. Does it work when you're in a group setting, when you are faced with limited research time, and when perhaps you have specific gatekeepers who would like you to meet particular people whilst in Uganda. So in small groups, we try and merge and bring together the diverse research interests of the students and try and make sure that they are adaptable to the different responses, different discussions that we have with our research participants. So we develop a grounded theory methodology for our research. We try and encourage students to think flexibly in the field, and that we talk about our daily briefings in a few moments. I'll talk about that, but how that helps ensure that the questions that are being asked by the students are relevant to those we are speaking to. And then we finish off the preparation with a walking tour of our actual host city, our own city, so Manchester. And McGinty talks about how this can help students practice the art of active listening, so that they are showing simple observational art of looking up, to quote McGinty, and courtesy towards somebody who's taken the time to explain their context to them. And so this is an actively experimenting part of the pre-departure phase. And then the first place we went to in Uganda was Mbarara, which is down in the southwest, and we did the same. We asked for a guided tour of that city, so that we could actually practice again our listening skills, but also get to know, become familiar with the context and the perceptions of that. And that was led by representatives from the LC5, which is the local council administration there. Then we move on to in situ. So Kolb's cycle talks about being the concrete experience that we have. So this is an assignment-focused research process. So the students have to complete an assignment, and there's a number of reasons for this. When I first started doing research visits, they didn't have any assignments linked to the field trips, and so students just either didn't partake in questions, or they just relied upon the module lead to instigate the discussions. However, as it's assignment focused now, they are now expected to constantly think about the research area that they find of most interest to them, but then also reflect on that and find out if that works with the populations that we are speaking to. We also have daily interrogation of our research ethics. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then finally, we work very closely with a number of organizations. So in the past, we have developed team-taught teaching with university students in Uganda. So we've done that in Gulu, and then we've also done it in Kampala. So this year we were with Makerere, and it was the social work department who specifically focused their teaching on refugees. And so we had a full half day where the Ugandan professor, who is one of the collaborators on this wider project that we have, gave their interpretation of displacement and refugees in Uganda. And then together we devised tasks for the students, both the Western-based students and the Ugandan-based students, to work on and interact. And this was important because it challenged our students' perspectives, challenged the norms that they engage with in the Manchester classroom. And we also do this at the beginning of the trip so they can develop relationships with their peers, and that can go beyond the actual research visit. And then we also have close relationships with organizations. We don't interview, we don't speak to individuals. We only speak to organizations, so namely NGOs or councils or UNHCR officers or civil society organizations. So one example of this is this year I introduced Golden Boots Uganda into the research visit as part of the visit. That was quite personal. I'm a football or soccer coach in the UK, and in previous visits I became aware of how important in the refugee settlements, how important soccer is for young people. And so we engaged with actually an organisation that works in the cities for urban refugees. And so we spent a day talking with the CEO of that organisation, but then we actually went out and played a soccer game with the South Sudanese female refugee team. And so we try to have in situ elements where we are collaborating very closely with the organisations, but making sure that it's on that top level rather than with individuals. And then Kolb talks about reflective observation, and this is something that must happen throughout the visit. So we have daily briefings, and no matter how tired our students were after a long day on the bus, we always had a daily briefing, because we needed to, firstly, for them to reframe their research questions based upon our methodology, practice developing the theories that they have engaged with already and what works and what doesn't work. But also, it's a time and a space for them to talk about what has made them feel uncomfortable, what hasn't worked in the day's visits, and also readjust their perceptions of what humanitarianism looks like, and also protect our well-being of each other, not just the students, but the faculty as well. And so now I move on to the discomfort part of my paper. Obviously, as it's a research visit, it's going abroad, it's going elsewhere, outside of Manchester. We have the formal risk assessment at Manchester. And I'd quite happily talk to you about all of that if you want me to, but mainly our formal risk assessment covers these areas, and it's changed, adapted over the years. Most recently for January's visit, we were potentially not going because of the Boler outbreak. And because I'm trying to explain that to a risk assessment committee in Manchester, that actually Uganda is well versed on how to respond to Ebola, and that we weren't going anywhere near those sub-districts was quite difficult, but obviously we still went ahead. And now obviously this just last week, Uganda has announced another bill against LGBTQI plus populations. So that would be an area that we also will consider for next year's visit in more detail. But I want to talk about my risk assessment that I do throughout the teaching, which is this idea of discomfort and protecting the well-being of both those we engage with, but also the students. So I want them, we know when they sign up for our teaching at Manchester at H2I, my institute that we work for, they know it's not an easy course. It's not an easy ride studying violence and conflict. But in this module, we constantly talk about ways in order to protect their own well-being throughout the time that they are learning about these difficult topics. We want to confront them, we want to engage with them, and we don't want to shy away from material. However, we also don't show material just for gratuitous effect. We carefully select the material that we engage with. We want students to feel that they have a safe space to challenge the lecturers or the faculty and each other about what they are learning and things that are being said, and that classroom space, whether it's in a classroom in Manchester or whether it's in our debriefing in a bar in Kampala, it's a safe space where they can engage and say, I'm not sure about how you dealt with that situation today when that NGO leader wanted to take us to this particular project. I think we should not have gone to that project, for example. Why did you choose to agree to that? And so I want them to feel that they can have those discussions with us, myself and my colleague who goes on the trip with me. I also want to provide students with the toolkits to support their own well-being and think carefully about how they look after their mental health in Manchester and how they might translate that to the Ugandan setting. And then we also have downtime. So I have included the picture safari because I said we contribute to the Ugandan economy, but actually by the time we've had the first week of our research visit, our students have engaged with a lot of difficult topics. It's been quite relentless. So we just have a day where they don't have to engage with me, I don't have to engage with them, and they just have some time just to think through everything. And a lot of them spend some time writing reflective diaries, which I encourage them to do. And then In terms of thinking about discomfort, my colleague Helen Underhill and I have been looking at this in terms of our teaching of humanitarian topics. And we use Megan Boler's work, 1999, and more recently Naomi Head's work on how we use discomfort as an actual conceptual tool in our teaching, whether that's in classroom or in experiential learning. And we try and situate these feelings of discomfort, whether that's to do with, well, Manchester Ethics Committee says this is not right, or this is really not a situation I want to be in. Try and make them think about how they interpret these feelings of discomfort and how they manage that in that space of doing research, something which they may encounter in their future careers. And then to consider these intersections of how we gain knowledge, how we know about displacement and refugees, and how that intersects with discomfort. And we want them to think about not just themselves. As we all know, our students can become quite focused on how they are feeling at the time, but we also want them to take them out of that box and go, how do you think those participants felt? You felt uncomfortable in that situation, but do you think your participants felt uncomfortable, or do you think they wanted to tell you that story? So we try and encourage them, and this is through 2 sessions that we have at Manchester, to be prepared for not knowing and for the discomfort that this may bring. We want them to be open to new and challenging experiences and voices and stories. So quite often we have had situations where the NGO has taken us to a project and said, this is what these refugees and host communities are doing. And then they ask the refugees or host communities to talk, and then they tell you a story that you were not expecting. A story that perhaps makes those students feel uncomfortable, but tells them the realities. And then we can have a discussion later about whether that is ethically right to have taken our students, or whether I should have taken students out of that situation. What was the right step to do that, into doing those kind of situations. But we want students to be willing to have their assumptions and values and beliefs challenged in these areas, but also to accept that their role, because they are researchers, because it's framed as a research visit, that they are not expected to respond and create action in that moment and help try and save that situation. So we use Padlet in our teaching to try and challenge the students and think about what topics might make them feel discomfort. And it leads to us coming through in situ and also reflectively after the research visit, thinking and challenging our Western norms that is ingrained us, especially those who are taught in British institutions. And as a group, try and recognise our strengths and weaknesses, and we do this through a SWOT analysis of who is best placed to ask those questions in that moment, and if we are presented with these scenarios, what do we do? And so scenario building and scenario role play is an important part of our preparation for our students. We try and encourage them to think about the power of storytelling, that we may not think it's appropriate to hear those stories, but actually those who are telling those stories might want to tell us those stories. And then we try and encourage our students to embrace that discomfort. And that's done through the assessment that we hold at the very end of the research visit, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So, in terms of our mental well-being of our students, as I spoke about earlier, the mental health is an increasing problem in British institutions. I don't know if it is the same in American institutions, where we are having our mental health teams' resources cut, where students can't get access to counsellors, mental health counsellors. And so we know that by engaging with these difficult topics, our students are going to be vulnerable. And so we ensure all our students prior to the visit see the occupational health team, which is like a health check. But then also that when we talk about mental well-being, I'm very open about my own mental health, how I support my own well-being, and then make them feel that they are comfortable if they wish to be the same, to be open as well if they want to. And we try and work out how they can maintain good mental health when they are in Uganda. And we discuss the risks associated with this. what risks might you have for your own well-being whilst you are out in the field. And then the final assessment, it takes all those different elements in terms of our pedagogy of the teaching, in terms of thinking about how we are feeling discomfort, but also the ethics that we have had challenged for us during the research visit. And we have now, I've developed a podcast where it's kind of like a BBC World Service radio show. On the last day of the research visit, the students come into a room with myself and my colleague, and we record, and they record a podcast for us. In the past, we've had written reports, but I always feel they're quite stale. They've had that time to reflect and go back to the literature. Actually, what we want is that raw reflection of their discomfort, their ethics, of how they have been challenged. So in a group, they then record this podcast, and they focus on a particular area. So one group this year focused on positionality, their positionality as an international group of students. Another group looked at their ethics and how they, the Western forms of the ethics review committees compared to how that translates to practice for research. So the final part of this presentation, you'll be pleased to hear, is on some of the challenges. You may not be surprised to hear that there are some colleagues at Manchester in both the Global Development Institute and the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute who find the idea of research visits in general very discomforting, very uncomfortable. They don't like the idea of taking students abroad to go look at humanitarianism, go research refugees, research the displaced. And so the first element that I think is a challenge is this extractive nature of the visits, and that tends to be the common area that comes up to them. There's very little written about this in terms of group research visits. There's a lot written about it in terms of individual researchers doing their PhD or graduate academic research, but very little in terms of how that works in terms of a group. And Wood talks about that researchers do take the long view, that their research, their understanding of those processes of conflict or displacement in our case, has actually a positive impact in the long run, because it shapes our students and it shapes the types of humanitarians that they will become. And we are very clear, and I come back and say this is a collaborative work. We do not just go in and say, you talk to us. If we encounter an organisation who do not want to come talk to us, we withdraw. But we also have a partner that works in Uganda, and they visit the organisations 3 months before we're due to go out to ensure that they are willing to participate. Whether it's a community organisation or top level UNHCR. And if we feel that that community doesn't want to take part, or we have been regularly to Chiriandongo camp in the north, and we feel that there is no longer an appetite for receiving visitors, then we say, okay, that's fine. And we move to another setting. And hence why we've been to Naturali this year. And then we do pay. We pay people for their time. And we are very open about that with the students at the beginning of their research visit, of that module. This module incurs a cost, and they need to be aware of that, because we pay people for their time. Time is precious when you are meant to be doing work within an organisation or helping communities for a variety of different tasks. So we are very clear that we pay our organisations that we engage with, which of course has its own challenges, but that's in the literature on research as well. We try to have proactive engagement. So like we did with the football, with the soccer organisation, we try and be proactive in terms of let's play a football game with them. But other examples are where our students have gone off with a particular organisation, a small group, to look at regreening projects and actually help contribute to that regreening project during the day for those who are interested in the environment and climate change for host communities, for example. And then we understand our limitations. We can contribute to the understanding of that particular context, but that we actually want our students to take what these lessons that they are learning back to their own settings. and how better we can improve situations of displacement throughout the globe. And then we do feedback. So we encourage our students to do a blog. I wrote this one with my student Finley about the experience of mental health and refugees as sport. And our students, two students have just released a blog this week on their experiences of the benefit of conversations in that research process. And I can provide you the link with that. I think it's just been put on the HCRI website. The second part is our environmental impact. And this is an area that I struggle with, because we are travelling 1,000 miles, says she, stood here in Madison, having come from Manchester via Montreal. It says that there was a study by the University of Montreal that says that students, international students, for example, can contribute something like 3.85 tons of carbon monoxide poisoning. And so I've been speaking to our students post-visit about this, and on our WhatsApp chat, we were talking about how best can we meet our environmental impact. We had these virtual research visits, but they are not the same. They have not provided the same benefits to our students. So these are a few ideas that our students came up with whilst we were talking. University of Manchester apparently is the first university in the world to have been recognised as a carbon literate organisation. I'm not quite sure what that means. So I said that to the students, and they said, well, let's find out exactly what that does mean. What does that mean in practice? Let's demand more from the university for carbon offsetting. And then another student thought of these potential ideas of how we can contribute to that. But then they also came back to me and said they learned a huge amount about the environment from that visit. And they learned about how communities were responding to climate change, refugee communities and host communities. And the example they gave me was the briquettes, and they are trying to create, rather than chopping down trees to create charcoal, they are forging these spaces where they can create these, completely forgotten what they're made out of, but these homegrown briquettes for fires. And there was a lot of discussion about the challenges of that for host communities and for the refugee communities, and that's quite labour intensive. But our students said they learned a lot about the environment from engaging with these organisations that are trying to promote these projects, that they thought they could take to other settings. And then finally, my final challenge is inclusivity. So the cost of the visit, it's quite expensive. It's quite a sum for our students to fly from Manchester. We have to pay for transport in Uganda. We have to pay obviously for our speakers, for our interactions with the organisations. And I only agreed to introduce this module into our institute if we had a bursary, which was around $12,000 a year that the department provided for 20 students. So roughly £500 per student to contribute. But actually, for some students who are also working, and we're within the cost of living crisis at the moment, we're going to change that and tweak that so we can provide an almost full bursary for a number of students to be able to. Humanitarianism is inherently a middle class profession. It inherently relies upon people who can do a free internship for a year. It relies upon students who can just go off and do that experience. And there are students, similar background to myself, who have never had that opportunity financially. So we are trying to change our bursaries and our options so that students can have that opportunity to also gain that experience. And we talk about a lot of support for students with mental health issues, but we haven't really engaged a huge amount with those living with physical disabilities. And this is a conversation I had 2 weeks ago in Montreal with a colleague from Winnipeg about how we support those students who do have physical disabilities, and that's a conversation we just started. So, conscious of time, I hope you've managed to write one word down on your post-it note, but I just want to finish off and say I thank you very much for listening. This is a research visit. This is a module that I do not take lightly on all levels. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work for all colleagues and students. And it's not something that our department, our head of the department, takes lightly, because it has a number of risks associated with it. But I believe that we try and mitigate these risks through my approach to experiential learning, through the pedagogy, through the engagement, the active engagement with discomfort, through trying to support students with their mental well-being, and of course through the formal risk assessment that we have. We have visits, so my module is regularly going to Uganda, but as I said, the undergraduate trip in the past has been to Belfast, and then also Mumbai, so it's not as if it's just taking place in the Ugandan setting. And I think I'll finish by saying the students and recipients of aid are always our priority in these visits, and they are not something that could be mutually exclusive. It's something we can take all together. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate any questions?
Well, you don't need to go through me for questions. Just raise your hand
and there's a gentleman behind you.
Oh, there we go.
I heard repeatedly that the UK has exported immigrants to Rwanda or Uganda. Can we expect that with the kind of activities that you undertake support, that with that they will maintain a good sort of a humanitarian type contact with the exports?
Yes. So that's one of the reasons why I chose Nachivali refugee settlement, which is in the southwest of Uganda, because it borders very closely to Rwanda.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were starting to think about where to go in January this year, it was in the news, obviously, that the British government were deciding to export, to use that word, export, to send asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing and for decisions, while they're waiting decisions to be made about their asylum. And so I thought, because Uganda has this refugee-friendly, it has this very much a country of being friendly towards refugees, was there a chance that some of these refugees who are sent to Rwanda may then move into Uganda? And there's not a huge amount I've spoken to you about the actual policies that the Ugandan government has, but it gives land, for example, to its refugee populations. It has very much a policy of providing any relief that goes to refugees is also provided to the host community. It's seen as being the most, I think one Guardian article called it the most friendly or the most welcoming place in the world to be a refugee. Mm-hmm. And so we spoke to our organisations in Nachivali. Are they worried about this British policy? And they said no, it wasn't something that was on their radar, but it was something they had heard about.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to create a British public that are going to be more humane to refugees? By teaching about this, I wish, but no, there's a very small number, and I didn't mention that, the number of students, I cap it at 20 students, 25 students. I hope that the more students that study these courses related to humanitarian response can actually have an impact, but sadly right now in the UK, I don't think much will change until we have a change of government, I'm afraid. And we've got a few more years till that happens, unfortunately. But yeah, it's extremely worrying. It's shameful to be British, in all regards. And yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering, you have presented all the lectures that you give to the students before they go and what they're going to be studying and, you know, mental health and discomfort and blah, blah, blah. I want to know what kind of preparation are they having to Uganda, such as the anthropology of Uganda, languages, etiquette, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we do spend just one lectutorial where we actually engage with what Uganda is, its history, its politics, and in that session I get our students to create presentations. So they come to the class and they present about their particular area. So one group's on history, one group's on society, so that's where they engage with the different language groups, the different kingdoms that have existed, and then another on politics, and then another group also engage with the the major refugee communities that we might meet. So this year it was Congolese and Rwandese. Why is there conflict in those settings? A lot of them know that already because they already study humanitarian response. But in terms of language, for a short 10-day research visit, being a linguist myself, I'm ashamed to say that we don't do a huge amount in engaging with that. We try and teach them some basic greetings, but we have to rely upon translators. And actually one of the group's final podcasts was the focus of their research discussion was about the use of translators and gatekeepers and how that may have affected the research that they engage with, and that, the impact that they have. But yeah, thank you for your question. There was a gentleman over there.
Oh, thank you so much. You've talked about the risks and the challenges of maybe doing research in these, especially conflict areas. I'm a little bit concerned about how do you reconcile your humanitarian response with that of academic learning, citing the fact that as a scholar or as a researcher, you go to this community of displaced persons who have sometimes been touched by the conditions and their status. But how do you really reconcile this? Especially you talked about the overall well-being or mental well-being of the students, but what about those of the displaced communities?
Yeah, so that's something I didn't mention, but it's in my paper. So we only engage with organizations that have a psychosocial element to their response, whether it's to the host community or the refugee community. So for example, Golden Boots, the one I was talking to you about earlier, they obviously create spaces where refugee youth, and by youth I mean from about the age of 12 up to 30, can play football, soccer. But they also do outreach programs for not just mental health, but also for period poverty, for GBV. So they go into the refugee communities and provide these psychosocial responses. So they have trained, I'm trying to think what they call them, counsellors perhaps is the right name for them, counsellors who would go into those communities and do outreach work, as well as the day-to-day of providing a space, a pitch for them to play football. And we talk about this in that 2-hour lectutorial that we have on the sub-theme of mental well-being. We don't just talk about our well-being, but I actually focus on the literature of refugees in Uganda, and there's quite a wealth of research being produced on PTSD, for example. But also they talk about the lack of support for depression, anxiety, and the different types of therapies and responses that NGOs are putting in place to support those communities. So I want to make our students literate on what mental health means in that setting, how it might be interpreted differently to our understanding, the Western norm of mental health, or I'm trying to think of the diagnosis of mental health that we have in the UK, for example, compared to what that looks like in the refugee setting in Uganda.
Thank you for your presentation. I wrote down, be prepared to not knowing. I was wondering, does that happen on both sides, like the organizations that you pick to work with in Uganda, do you also like sort of like have a certain list of criteria of they need to have A, B, C, and D? Because I find that you're going to prepare these people from this side, and then yes, there'll be some surprises. There are already surprises.
Yeah.
But also on the other hand, I find that there's surprises. Like, oh yeah, these people showed up and we were not expecting this and that, right? I can give an example, maybe this is just like an example. If for the places you're working in, like Nachibalo, these are very remote areas, and to show up as a white person, and you're from the LGBT community as an example, these people have never interacted with anyone from that, like from that community, and then it's a student who shows up, they're surprised, and also really surprised So are there criteria or like things that this you look at? Okay, maybe this is organization we're going to work with, or these are also modules that organization, that staff that are going to be interacting directly with the students are going to like maybe interact with, so that by the time they show up, both ends are prepared. But of course, you're still leaving room for the surprises. I just was wondering.
Yeah, so we work very closely with a partner in Uganda it's an organisation that's based in Uganda that helps organise student research visits. I'm very open about that fact because I wouldn't be able to organise these visits without their support. And they, as I said earlier, they meet up with the organisations that are potentially on our list. They know my teaching criteria. So I have adapted the teaching criteria based upon each visit. So I come back and go, okay, well, whatever it was, land is no longer important, so we'll scrap that for the module. We'll actually move on to this. Obviously, we've still kept land. We've kept climate change has become part of that land lecture now on the environment. But mental health was introduced this year, and that's as a response to our virtual visit that we had last year, and the responses from organisations. So this partner has these 4 sub-themes, and they speak to the organisations. They ensure that they are willing to participate. But there are instances where you get for example, the leaders of that NGO say, yeah, actually we want to take you, you've got a bus, we're going to take you to this project. And we turn up, and that project has no idea that we're going to show up. And therefore I have to quickly make a decision of, okay, shall I ask if they could take us back because they obviously do not know, not expecting us here, or do we trust in that organisation, trust that they know what they are doing and that they have developed that relationship with that project, that they are happy with it. And this is why our daily debriefings are so important, because we really say, what could we have done better in those situations? Because that does reflect real individual academic research as well. But we usually I have a list of areas that we have covered and questions, general research questions that we've covered that we provide to the organisation prior to a visit. But as I've said, we try not to be dictatorial about that, because that's no longer relevant. Why are you asking about that? It's just not relevant to us at all. And I suppose we sensitise our students to understanding what that community is like, how they might perceive LGBTQ communities, for example, or how that might be perceived. But actually, so I hope I've got time. There was one case study we spoke to in Mbarara. They have a lot of urban refugees, so refugees who choose to leave the settlement and move into the city. And there's an organisation which is mixed Somali, Congolese and Rwandese, and their leaders came to talk to us at the hotel that we were staying at. And they started talking to us about the outreach work that they do, and then they said, one of the questions was, well, why did you choose to leave the settlement? Oh, because we can be who we want to be in the city centre. And we didn't really understand that, and it took us a while, because our students were very conscious of talking about LGBTQI issues. They didn't ask those questions, but they told us that they all identified as queer and that they felt safer to be in the city than in the settlement. And then we had our discussion on our debrief. They've told us that. Would they have told that to a Ugandan who they just met? Probably not. So how do we then take that data, that information? And as you will know from the module, none of the actual outcomes of our research is an output. The actual assessment is reflecting on the research process. And they could talk about it in their blogs, their blog posts, but we really focus on these kind of situations where, do we actually mention anybody? We encourage our students not to, we tell them not to use names.
Thank you.
Not just the bells.
Those are the bells.
Yeah.